Welcome to the Black American Experience, Wealth, Race in the Workforce. We have muted everyone and want you to know that because of the great amount of people that we have, we are going to allow you to use the chat room. And also we have allowed time at the end of the presentation so that you can ask questions. But if at any time you need to ask a question, please put it in the chat. And with my partners in the background, we'll be able to ask the panelists a question. Next slide, please. Okay. Well, welcome to the DEI Leaders Network. And what we want to know, we put on these productions every month to make sure that we are providing everyone the opportunity to learn more about DEI. The Leaders Network was created because we found that the role of the DEI professional can be a very lonely one in a lot of organizations, unless you're lucky enough to have a team. The DEI leaders often shoulder an enormous amount of responsibility on challenging topics. This network is intended to give the DEI leader community an opportunity and a place to lean on and to learn from. And we really appreciate that you all are here today. Next slide, please. And I mentioned before, since we have a large number of people in the community right now today, we are going to mute the participants. We just kicked off what's called the DEI Leaders Network. This is an opportunity to continue the conversation offline, and it's going to be on LinkedIn. We're going to call ourselves the DN Network, hopefully similar to CNN. I know it's a little corny, but we really appreciate that. You'll be invited to continue the conversation, because as we go through this process, we won't be able to answer all your questions, but we want this to be a community that's for you, about you. Next slide. You'll receive the link after the webinar. And we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and want to tell you about, we are a woman-owned company, and we evaluate organizations' DEI performance using a data-driven approach. We believe that effective DEI strategies are grounded in business drivers, and that many organizations can demonstrate their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not only is it the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, it's the relevant thing to do. As we look at today, which is, we're going to look at our matrix. Next slide. We'll talk today about the topic of Black experience, wealth, race in the workforce. This is an area that we consider during a client engagement. We consider every aspect of what we're looking at here, our evaluation process. This is part of our assessment strategy, the way we look at it. If you look at the wheels, we believe you have to look at your strategy, look at your internal processes, and you look at your external process. The topic today, the Black wealth experience, will discuss the external process, but it also has an impact on the internal process. We describe the racial gap as the disparity between the wealth of different racial and ethnics in the United States. It's a complex issue caused by a combination of historical, structural, and individual factors. To address these issues, we've asked our panelists to speak about the historical data and prescribe a future state on how we can create solutions, equality, and opportunity for all. Next slide. All right, so today, as we start, we want to do something fun. We have a group of notable Black figures and investors, and we wanted to see how many of them that you could identify. Let's take a look. If you would put in the chat, please, we love that. We could start, you know, everybody knows Maya Angelou, I'm sure. Some notable figures.
Yes, there we go.
Huh? We have, let's see. I see a lot of people are putting in. Hello, everyone, just 1 through 6. Some people don't even recognize. So I'm going to just quickly go through them. We have Valerie Thomas, who's a data scientist. She was responsible for developing the digital format and images. Lonnie Johnson, a good friend, super soaker. He did the water gun. You see Hannah Nicole Jones. She's part of the 1619 Project. She's an investigative reporter, and her project really re-examined the legacy of slavery in the United States. And I think the other, I do not know, is Miss Thomas. Yeah, okay, great. I see that. Someone didn't know Miss Thomas. Yeah, I didn't either. That was all new to me too. And I found that out. That was so interesting that about her, that she really did this, right? Next slide. As I stated before today, the racial wealth gap is what we're going to talk about today. I said it's a term we use to describe the different racial ethnic groups in the United States. And our panelists today will present the historical data and provide a solution. Our panelists are both leaders in the Washington, D.C. area. And I wanted to introduce William Michael Cunningham. He's an economist and a highly skilled environmental social government expert. He received his MBA in finance and a master's in economics from the University of Chicago. Mr. Cunningham has served on the faculty of George Washington University. He is the founder and owner of Creative Investment Research. He delivers compelling thoughts, and he does wonderful presentation. He's recognized for his presence in all social forecasts. He's warned regulators about the Nigerian scam. In 1995, he warned about the risk of mega bank mergers, a risk which 20 years later, the merger of partners acknowledged. He is the author of the first book on the Jobs Act and crowdfunding. Our next panelist is Ivory Johnson. Ivory is founder of Delancey Wealth Management Financial Planning on Capitol Hill. He also managed a firm with over $1 billion in assets. Mr. Johnson has a BS in finance from Penn State University and is a certified financial planner. He is also CNBC's Financial Advisor Council member and writes quarterly for the Wall Street Journal. He's a member of Alpha Phi fraternity. We won't hold that against him. 100 Black men, and has received numerous awards for his excellence in his craft and mentorship. So now I present to you Bill Cunningham. We're going to call him Bill today, and he's going to start. Next slide. Bill will give us a historical perspective of what it is, look at the structural changes, and define any inequalities that may be preventing us from getting to where we need to be. It's important that we understand where we came from so that we could really devise a solution that will solve some of the traumas that have happened historically. Go ahead, Bill.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Rosemont, for that. I should note that I'm adjunct at Georgetown University, but only adjunct. You know, they get pretty touchy about that whole full professor versus adjunct thing. So what I want to do is go through some of the historical data, taking a look at unemployment. And the way that we examine trends in that marketplace is by looking at the difference between Black unemployment and all unemployment. That is an indicator of labor market discrimination, one that we use to determine how things are going from a discriminatory standpoint. Next slide, please. Actually, you want to go back to there you go, right there. So this is a chart that shows the difference between Black unemployment and all unemployment, starting in 1972 to 2023. Now, the important point of this slide is that the US government really didn't start to measure Black unemployment officially until 1972. And that was at the behest of a guy that I used to work for, Andrew Brimmer, who was the first Black on the Federal Reserve Board. Black unemployment was a big topic around that time, but they discovered they didn't have any official metrics to capture that information. There were some unofficial private studies that had been done that actually showed that Black unemployment was lower than white unemployment, going back to the early parts of the 19th century. No surprise, given slavery and all. But this was the modern recounting of that data. Next slide, please. So that's the full scope of the data. We want to take a look at a narrower set of information and see what's happened over the recent years. If you look at the Biden administration and what's going on there. So that's what the next slide does. And basically, we want to go back one. There you go. Okay. So basically what this is showing is that the difference between Black unemployment and all unemployment is falling. It's falling faster under the Biden administration than it has under any other administration. Now, people, because I'm an economist, you know what they say about economists, it's called the dismal science for a reason, because we're always looking at the negative side of some of these statistics. But here, I am pleased to report that it appears that labor market discrimination is, in point of fact, falling when it comes to Black discrimination in the labor market. Now, we still have a ways to go. As of the most recent January numbers, we see that Black unemployment was 5.4%, and that white or all unemployment, it's not just white, it's all unemployment, 3.4%. So that's a difference of 2%, 2 percentage points, 200 basis points. One of the lowest differentials on record. So we're making progress. We've got to keep moving, but we are definitely making progress in keeping with the theme of this meeting. Of course, lower unemployment implies higher wealth overall. But let's go to the next slide and start to drill down on the mechanics of generating wealth. So this is a chart that shows venture capital financing going, no, the next slide after this, that shows percentage of US venture capital funding going to Black people from 2013 to 2022. Now, recently, if you take a look at the 2021 slide, bar, you'll see that it was at a very elevated level, historically speaking, and that it has fallen off. Well, this is typical, and we've seen this before. We attribute the gains in 2021 to George Floyd, and we attribute the decline in 2022 to what we often see in the Black community when there are incidents like this. We saw this with Rodney King. We saw it prior. The activity, the attention tends to fall off. But I do want to point you to the gray dotted line at the top, which shows the trend line in venture capital funding to Black founders. It's still moving up. It's still doing up. The blue dotted line, by the way, shows the venture capital trends overall. But the gray line shows that, you know, the amount going to Black founders is still increasing, moving from 568 million in 2013 to 2.2 billion by 2022. So those are good signs. But a caveat, and I'll talk about this a little later. We don't think venture capital is the right tool for generating wealth in the Black community. But again, I'll get back to that and I'll talk about that a little later. So Denise,
Bill,
let me turn it back over to you.
go ahead. You want to finish up?
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, can you speak on the policies that affect that's most effective in closing the racial wealth gap?
Well, certainly this is why we are absolutely enamored by the Biden administration. A whole of government approach has proven to be the most effective way to make broad scale changes and improvements in Black wealth. You've got to look at the issue from a holistic perspective, and you can't be shy about attributing historical discrimination to the current situation. That's why a whole of government approach tends to work. The other thing that we say is if you look at the experience of Black people moving up from the South in the 1940s to the northern urban areas, what worked in terms of generating wealth was an all of community approach, a broad scale approach where everybody worked together without necessarily focusing only on money. The problem with focusing on money from that perspective is that it generates a lot of negative externalities, negative behaviors, selfish behaviors, which run against the grain with respect to a community increasing its wealth profile. Does that cover it? Is that helpful?
Yes, that's helpful. That's helpful. Go ahead.
So I think I'll stop there. I have a couple of other slides coming up, but I'll just kind of leave it there for right now, if that's okay.
And Ivory, would you like to comment on any of the slides so far?
I think the trend is positive. One concern I always have is that employment is sort of a lagging indicator. So what happens is if you look at the employment cost index right now, it's about 5%. Traditionally, that's between 2 and 3%. And so anytime wages go up, corporate profits get squeezed and then they begin to lay people off. And so when you look at who gets laid off first, we're more likely to fit that category. And given that GDP and inflation, we still have inflation, but we have what's called disinflation. It's going up slower. So in this environment, and if you look at some of the economic data with the odds of a recession coming, you would expect unemployment to actually start to tick up as we go into a recession. That's really the last thing. That's the last shoe to drop. Is you start to see wages go up, and then you see labor reduce its workforce, and you're already beginning to see many of the layoff announcements.
Now, I will say that our forecast is that we are not going to go into a recession. We think the Fed is going to get its soft landing. We think that the Fed has managed this situation masterfully, and that we will actually escape a recession.
Right. Well, that would be healthy debate, right? Healthy debate.
All right. And explain to us, Bill, about the women in the workplace and the impact and what are the barriers to the advancement and how does that show up?
So one of the things I said at the Congressional Black Caucus, I think that was 2018, was that Black women are the key to Black economic advancement. Black women are getting more degrees. They're getting higher level of degrees. They really are driving the economic engine forward for Black people. But they face two barriers, one of which is, of course, gender, and the second is race. So, and this points to the productivity and the strength of this demographic. Anytime you've got a group that's facing these twin barriers, but who are still making great strides, you know that you have a super productive group of people in that demographic. So we see Black women as key to increasing Black wealth through their educational advancement and through their occupational advancement. But we also know that they are going to face significant problems going forward as they continue to move higher. So that's what I think this slide is showing. I would also point out that the advancement of Black women is consistent with our theory that what it's going to take in order to make a significant impact on Black wealth is a community and a collaborative effort. Everybody knows that women in general tend to be more community-oriented, more collaborative, certainly, than guys are. We got that whole male ego thing working, which often gets in the way. And we've seen that on a serious note. We certainly have seen the negative impacts of that in the Black community with respect to Black men. So it's almost as if our one chance of getting out of this really rests on the shoulders of Black women.
Great. Definitely, and thank you for that perspective. Ivory, like any comments?
Well, African-American women are actually the fastest growing demographic of business owners. So it's to his point, and not just what you see reported, but even the Black market. They're it's the old adage that the American dream is free, but the hustle is sold separate. And so they often have, side jobs that may not get reported. But one point I'd make is that it would be very helpful if you start to work in concert, if you start to see both, demographics rise at the same rate. And I think they have different challenges, which we'd all agree on.
Definitely. Yeah. And Diversity Works is also an opportunity to help you look at your whole internal workforce regarding what barriers that you have internally to all ethnic groups, and especially to Black women or women in general. Next slide. All right. Hold it. We went a little bit too far. All right. And can we expand on this, Bill? We talked about it yesterday.
Sure. I mean, this is really the key. You see that the median white family has 184,000 in wealth, and that the median Black family has 23,000 in wealth. This influences your ability to do everything in a capitalistic society. Start a business, pay for school, pay for a house, get a car. It just really is one of the keys to the lack of economic advancement in the Black community. Now, having said that, let me say this, and this is going to be a little controversial. If you really want to solve the Black wealth problem, what you would have is you'd probably have the federal government come in and make up that difference between 184,000 and 23,000. That's what I think. One way or another, either by eliminating the requirement that Black people pay taxes, making education free for the descendants of slaves and something. You do something that would have a major macro impact on the Black community, special and apart from the other communities. And the other issue is, and I said this too, I'm going to put the link to the video at the Congressional Black Caucus in the chat room. But I said this too, part of the reason why that is problematic is because we know that people in the poor whites and poor immigrants would definitely interfere with that adjustment process. So we really can't ask external parties, including the federal government, to come in and do what the economics says that you should do until we really consider all of the unintended consequences and the impacts that such a policy would have on the country as a whole. We also know that part of what's driving the political instability that we're seeing right now is related to certain parts of the demographics being poorer. We've seen white life expectancy go down. We've seen white income go down. So until we deal with all of these issues, again, from a purely economic standpoint of having a third party come in and make up that differential, we know that's not going to work. So let's think about other real world solutions, other effective solutions that would address this gap. But this is the key. These are the key numbers that point to exactly what the problem is.
Ivory, want to comment?
Well, I think to Bill's point, politically that would be very difficult to enforce. We are having a hard time getting, voting rights, and my son got his driver's license and got pulled over 5 times the first 10 months without committing an infraction. So to go one step further to level the playing base is difficult. And I think we have to start with where we're at, which is going to be the crux of what I discuss here today. Okay,
great, good. All right, and let's talk about the wealth in the Black community. Bill Cunningham, next slide, please. Let's go. Okay.
All right, so my comments have been leading up to this. It's our contention that wealth maximization is the wrong goal. The focus should be on life maximization. Now, why is that? Because a materialistic focus will never work in a society that does everything it can to deny material comfort to Black people. The reason why the society does this It's a strategy to maximize white wealth. So you can't expect that this culture is going to maximize your wealth when it sees your economic subjugation as the way in which they maximize their own wealth. And now it's not true. We know it doesn't work for the majority of white people, but that's the perception. So one of the solutions is to realize that money is a proxy for life in this culture. So wealth equals life according to the popular culture. But the solution is to realize that wealth does not equal life. Black people are experts at survival and life maximization in a hostile environment. This is the strategy that will work going forward, and it has the added benefit of evening out the wealth gap, but focusing on life maximization, as we did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as we built communities in the northern urban centers that led to the creation of institutions like Motown, taking something that was a resource, an asset, a skill in the Black community, and making it a global brand, an absolute global brand to the benefit not only of the Black community, but to the broader world. You can make the same case about other artistic endeavors that Black people have been a part of, but they come out of a community focus, not a monetary focus at their start. And we think that that's the solution. And strange as it is, we think that that will generate a solution to the wealth gap over time.
And after Ivory give his perspective, I'll tell you how diversity works, how we look at that process when we are doing our analysis and our engagement with people, with the clients. We do look at all aspects to make sure that all groups really take a look so we can maximize the importance of each individual. Go ahead, Ivory.
Yeah, I mean, I apply it to, what I do with my clients as a wealth advisor. We're pigeonholed into trying to increase what they have in the bank. The reality is there are clients, and anecdotally, who they focus so much on creating wealth, getting the corner office, that by the time they retire, they haven't spent the time building up those relationships that Bill talks about. They didn't go on the fishing trips, the golf trips, the girls' weekend. And they have no social capital anymore. And so I've actually had clients who go through depression who have millions of dollars because they go from being, Bob with the corner office to some guy with khakis who can't find a 3-inch, drill bit at Home Depot. I have a client who does gardening. Not that she needs the money, but it makes her feel better, gives her peace of mind. She's somebody who worries about money. But now she has a whole nother social contract with the community. She's physically active, which reduces health outcomes. And so by helping clients find their sense of purpose and things that make them happy, when you don't focus just on the wealth, you focus on being happy, which should be the goal.
Exactly. And that's so true and important as we help organizations look at what's going on internally. Part of the strategy, we're looking at now the external, but we want to make that connection that we talk about what DEI means and how it relates. It's a way to make sure that, everybody feels belong and they're part of that process. And then what we do, our initiative, we make sure that everything gets embedded in the organization. So part of that, maximizing your life is really being really comfortable with who you are and where you're going, and then the people that you are committed to every day. Our next slide. All right. Ooh, okay, hold on. We'll get to you in a second. All right. About closing the Black racial wage gap, and then we'll get into where Ivory will talk about, we're going to talk about wealth, but in a different ways. We'll talk about how we can change some of the structures in the systems. Mr. Bill Cunningham, go ahead.
So, one of the things that we said very early on was that one of the reasons why Martin Luther King was so impactful is because by getting rid of Jim Crow, you actually increased economic output by $20 trillion. in the United States of America. This also gets to understanding the true nature of the problem that we face. The culture is willing to forego that added economic gain because some people get some kind of psychic income, some kind of mental benefit to themselves by being discriminatory and by being discriminatory against Black people. They know that there's a monetary cost to it. And if you want a further confirmation of that, you should look at what's going on in the UK with Brexit, which is a similar kind of racist idiocy because it costs the UK another probably $200 billion by getting out of the Europe. It makes no as an economist, I'm offended by this sort of stuff. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever until you figure out that this kind of discrimination and racism has some psychic mental value for certain people. And one of the things that we have to do, I know Mr. Johnson talks about understanding the psychological aspects of wealth. He just talked about how happiness is kind of not purchased fully by nothing but money. Part of what we've got to do is understand that there are these psychological dimensions to this racial hatred that shows up in a decline in economic activity. No, we've made that very clear. And part of what we need to do is we can't dodge that. We need to go right at it. This comes, by the way, from one of my University of Chicago professors. I'll refer you to him, Gary Becker, who wrote a book in 1954, The Economics of Discrimination, where he started to kind of approach these same issues. So if we're going to deal with this, we're going to have to understand the psychological motivation behind some of this discriminatory behavior.
Thank you. Ivory, any comment before we get to your next slide?
Well, there's an opportunity cost. If the next Bill Gates is an underserved area with underfunded schools, then he doesn't create something that we don't know we want yet, and that mitigates economic growth. It increases the footprint on the social safety net. And so now we've come to a point where we have $31 trillion in debt. $7 trillion has to be refinanced in fiscal year 2023. If they pay an extra 175 basis points, that's $120 billion in additional interest payments they have to make. That's just for 1 year. Not to mention the $100 billion that the Fed won't be sending to the Treasury anymore, because now they're running a deficit because they're paying more interest to the commercial banks relative to what they're getting on their balance sheet. So I'm talking about 15% of the military budget, which is $120 billion. So now the government doesn't have the ability, to fund so many programs, even though we now have an $80 billion a year prison industry, because African Americans were 3 to 4 times as likely to be arrested for drugs and selling drugs. So some of the racial policies created an expense that now we can no longer afford.
And thank you for that. So we look at, that's an opportunity cost, as you stated, Ivory. In addition, when we look at an engagement, we look at all the opportunities that the organization is facing, the challenges and how they can change. We look at their wage gap analysis. We look at the internal structures and how people are positioned in the position and whether or not they freaking belong. That's also an opportunity cost. So at Diversity Works, that's one of the things we really focus on, to look at all aspects, doing like a whole 360 view, as you all have stated. Now we get back to next slide, which is you're going to talk about the tenets of capitalism. And hold on a second.
Yeah, that's it.
No, who's all right? Next slide, please. Hold on.
All
Okay,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I try to review the wealth gap through non-emotional structures, right? And so we're always told that the pathway to wealth is the free markets and capitalism, which means that the private industry distributes wealth. It's a meritocracy. The best and the brightest thrive. And we tend to rail against socialism, which is when the government distributes, winners, distributes wealth. But to have capitalism, you need, there's certain pillars, right? One is access to capital. Obviously, we talked about home ownership. It's the largest source of wealth for the middle class. And just imagine for a second, if we could not borrow money to buy a house. And that's why the tax code is written for landowners as well as business owners. But the tax code heavily influences and motivates and incents people who buy a house. But oddly enough, in the financial crisis, we were third more likely to get a subprime loan than our so-called lighter counterparts. That has not changed. There's a study in Philadelphia. Whites were 10 times as likely to get a conventional loan as say, African Americans. And we don't need to get into the nitty gritty about Wells Fargo and all the banks that have been fined for discrimination. And so if you understand that access to capital means you can buy a home, you can pay for college, you can start a business, which, by the way, is the biggest source of employment, small businesses in the country. That's huge. So without access to capital, it's hard to have, capitalism. Fungible assets just means that your house or your asset is valued the same way as somebody else's. So if Denise and I both have a number 2 pencil that's sharp, they should both be valued the same way. But that hasn't been the case historically, right? You have redlining, which meant they put a red line around Black neighborhoods and said, well, we can't give federally backed loans. So obviously, if you're not eligible for a federally backed loan, your house isn't going to be valued the same way. It also extended to redlining being the way they describe not showing African Americans houses in white neighborhoods. And just to be clear, it was the policy of the National Association of Realtors until the late 1960s not to show African Americans and people of color homes. And just imagine what this means when your home isn't valued the same way as somebody else's. And this isn't something that happened 50 years ago. There was a case in Oakland, California, where somebody got $500,000 more for their house because they had somebody white pretend to live there and sell the house. Any Black person will tell you that if they're selling their house, one of the first things they do is remove any evidence that African Americans live there. You take down the pictures, you take down the African art. If you like James Baldwin, put those books in storage because it will absolutely impact the value of your house. So our assets are not fungible, being paid according to what the free markets are willing to bear. Slavery notwithstanding. Jim Crow, where public policy decided who could make what, mandated it even. And so you can make the case that Jim Crow and Karl Marx were attached at the hip. But right now, if you have a bachelor's degree, African Americans, the wage gap is you get paid 82 cents on the dollar. As you get higher degrees, it gets worse. So now you get paid 70 cents on the dollar. And when you look at it's interesting, when you talk about the wage gap versus the wealth gap is wider. Why? Real estate. Okay, so think about if you can't buy real estate and how that works. So, just anecdotally, I bought a apartment in New York City. I'm from the Lower East Side. Not the best neighborhood then, it is now. But my father, I told him I wanted to buy a car. He said, what color? I told him. He says, well, make sure it has a shower inside. I asked him why. He said, because you're going to have to live in it. If you're dumb enough to buy a car, you have to get the hell out of my house, right? So I bought an apartment in the neighborhood for 20 grand, right? It's now worth, think about it, it's now worth 500, not because I'm a mogul. I just had access to information. When I pass away, in 20 years, let's say it's worth $1 million. The cost basis now is $1 million. That means my son can get passive income. That means he gets a tax deduction of $36,000 a year from depreciation. So if I was told because of what I look like, I was unable to make that transaction, that eliminates hundreds of thousands of dollars of wealth. Okay, so that's why it's important that we get paid according to what we're willing to bear and have fungible assets. And of course, enforcement of contract. I think there was a study where 65% of judges said there's systemic racism in a criminal justice system. It's a system where African-American men spend 20 more years in prison, get a sentence for 20 years longer than their so-called lighter counterparts for the same crime with the same background. I can tell you anecdotally, having been through a non-compete contract dispute, we get treated differently. And so if you can't enforce a contract, if the idea is I agree and get paid to create a widget, and Denise has no way, no way to recoup her money if I don't produce, you can't have capitalism. So anytime the public policy or social contracts pick winners and losers, that is socialism. And so if you're subject to socialism and told that the way out of your ditch is capitalism, when you don't have access to the basic tenets of capitalism, that is a shady deal. And it becomes very difficult for us to close the gap. Okay.
Great. Thank you. That's so true. Should have told that to my son for buying a Tesla.
Right. Well, we'll talk about that next.
All right, let's go.
Um,
Hold on. Oh, how is this happening?
there you go. So yeah, the first thing, look, so that's what happened. So what's the solution? How do you control the things that you can control, right? Money is very emotional. And, to your point about your son, because I have a 25-year-old also, right? When you grow up, a lot of us, when we grow up resource starved, one of the first things we try to do is prove that we're no longer in that predicament. You can't go back to the neighborhood with a 401k statement, right? But you can certainly go back with a Ford, with a nice car, rather, right? You can certainly go back with nice clothes, which, by the way, are depreciating assets. And so, and by the way, there's some biologically predictable behaviors. There's something called the amygdala that gets overridden when you go through a stressful environment. And so what will happen is the reptilian brain, which is it controls the 4 F's: food, fight, flight, and reproduction, right? And so all of a sudden the neocortex gets shut down. And so when the market is going down, you sell at the bottom, because instinctively you're like, I need food. So some of this is biologically predictable behavior. So sometimes it's good to take a breath and understand that, and then live it in the present. Understand why you're making some of the financial decisions that you are. Understand that trauma changes your cell structures. It changes how your neocortex operates. And so a lot of us are confronted with these trauma from the past, and it impacts how we manage money. The second thing is budgeting. You know your needs versus your wants, and then start to do some planning. Nobody would buy crown molding before they built the house. So you really want to make sure you're connecting all of the dots so that you can start to have a plan to create wealth. One of those is to mitigate tax exposure, right? I mean, there's 4 ways to lose wealth: taxes, divorce, lawsuits, and doing something stupid. Advisors can help you with 2 of those things, but you are paying taxes on when you make it, which is income, when you have it, which might be real estate, when you invest it, which is capital gains, when you die with it, which is estate planning, when you spend it, which is sales tax. Plus, there are excise taxes like the 42 cents you pay for a gallon of gas. In the state of Maryland, there's like an additional tax burden of 9.5%. So if your effective tax rate is 20% and you're paying 9.5% through these other taxes, you're at 39%. Then you've got Social Security. And if you're self-employed, that's another 15.3%. So mitigating taxes is incredibly important. It's written for business owners and it's written for homeowners. But if you're a W-2 employee, you can maximize your 401k. You can buy rental real estate. There are things that you can do to stop Uncle Sam from fleecing you, so to speak. Estate planning is giving what you have to who you want, when you want, the way you want, with the least amount of taxes and expenses possible. One of the reasons that a lot of neighborhoods get gentrified is because somebody passes away with a house. There's no structure on how it gets distributed. They sell the house for pennies on a dollar. Somebody comes in, puts hardwood floors down, they flip it with a new kitchen, sell it for twice as much. The way you create wealth is to be very intentional about it, and be intentional about leaving your children assets so that they don't have to work as hard as you do. Risk management, just protecting yourself against an unforeseen loss. Here's a good one: long-term care. I mean, think about what happens when a parent gets elderly and they get, the dementia, like my father has now. All right, it becomes very incredibly disruptive. Why? What'll happen is the child who makes the most money is then expected to pay the cost. And I'm not talking $2,000 a month. I'm talking $8,000 to $10,000 a month. What happens is, and I've seen this, the child who makes the most money says, well, the reason I make the most money is because I didn't do that you did. And now you're separating the family. And then the spouses get involved. So long-term care also protects going on Medicaid. Half of all Medicaid expenses are nursing homes. Well, guess what happens when you go on Medicaid? When you pass away, then they take your house. So even if you have been intentional about buying real estate, the state will come back and recapture those assets. So life insurance is important, long-term care, make sure you don't get sued with an umbrella policy. And all that feeds into investing, because if you're saving money for retirement, presumably that's in a 401k plan or a SEP plan or an IRA. So these are different vehicles that you can use that you can then invest in the equities market if the time is right. And the last thing I'd say about investing is when you hire an advisor, make sure they have a process. Okay, pie charts are that's not a risk management strategy, that's marketing. Make sure that it's either they're looking at future cash flow or they're looking at macroeconomic events. If they can't explain a process to you, because you always judge the outcome, the decision rather, by the process, not so much by the outcome. If you draw 17 on the blackjack table and you pull a 4, that was a bad move to draw another card, right? So look at the process and have them explain it to you in very, very obvious terms so that you can understand it. If they can't explain it to you, that means they don't understand it either. So that's my point. Those are my points for today.
At Diversity Works, we're not afraid to have the meaningful conversation, the deep conversations as we presented to you today. It's important to understand the wealth and see how the economics impact the society as a whole and in your organization. A lot of times we go in and we dissect. We want to let you know exactly what's going on. And we do that through our rigorous, data-driven assessments. We look at quantitative and qualitative, and we present you the pictures just like we did with these two awesome panelists today. And one of the things that we looked at, and we're going to go quick because we have limited amount of time left. These are some occupations that we identified that are going to be at risk in the future. And if you want to comment, Ivory, real quick about that, we did go through that, accountants and auditors. We look at that. That's one of the ones.
Well, yeah, it was years ago. By Friedman wrote the book "The World Is Flat," and he was talking about how they're outsourcing accountants. They can automate a lot of these functions out, but if I'm going into the workforce, and I tell my son this is, skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is.
Exactly.
So if you see someone fixing an automatic checkout machine, you don't be a cashier, be the guy who fixes the automated machine.
And then the next one is when we looked at, hold on. And we look at the 5 occupations, again, that's are at risk, and then the ones that are, that may not be as risk. You want to comment on those real quick, Bill?
Well, it just shows once again, we just got to the party and now they're pulling the punch bowl. So what you're seeing are a lot of the occupations that, again, Black, and this, I love this data because it focuses on percentage of the Black workforce. Cashiers, 2% of all people employed, 3% of the Black workforce. When that gets automated, that means that's going to hit the Black community especially hard. As it is automated, those jobs are definitely going away. And once again, what we want to do is, as Mr. Johnson has correctly pointed out, we want to skate to where the puck is going to be. So we know this is coming down the pipe. So what are the strategies that we should have in place to mute, to lower the negative economic impact of this change? What we've said is that don't go looking for venture capital. They're racist. They're not going to fund you. Okay. Think about something else. Work on a community basis to generate economic opportunities. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Questions were real quick, but we want to make sure that we look at so part of the racial inclusion and share prosperity, we want to look at your strategy. What we do at Diversity Works, we want to make sure in this particular case, make racial equity a strategic priority. Track and measure progress. It's very important that you track. If you don't track it, you don't know what's really going on. Look at your internal process. Look at your hiring, your recruitment. And we talked about a lot of historical perspective, what's happening in the Black community. It's probably happening in a lot of other communities. Pay a living wage. That's your internal process. Look at your pay equity audits. We could help with this. And look at your job description, which is important. We talked about the executive order that the president has put out. He has a real aggressive means for racial equity, trying to balance what may have been happening. And just the fact that sometimes we have our biases and we're just not noticing what's really happening. And support organization, I believe that Ivory and Bill talked about that. Look at organizations that support policies that you want to make sure that you have a world that's going to remember. And that's part of our call to action. And I believe that Bill is going to talk about a few, and then we'll let Ivory close up, and then we'll see if we have Q&As. All right, real quick.
So I'll talk about this pretty quickly. Hopefully these will be distributed. My 3 calls to action are: number 1, the book I just put out last year, Thriving as a Minority-Owned Business in Corporate America. We touch on a lot of these topics. We also have a free class, How to Finance a Black Woman-Owned Business in 2022. It's on Udemy. And then finally, for this crowd, for this advanced, very connected crowd, we have submitted a petition to the Securities and Exchange Commission to ask them to hold corporations accountable for their Black Lives Matter pledges. And you can go to blacklivesmattercorporatepledges.com. It's kind of a long title to get more information on that. But write to the SEC, request that they require companies to put in their annual report what they're doing with respect to their Black Lives Matter pledges. So that's it.
And I believe it's important that you really seek out a wealth management person. Ivory, you want to give your call to action to look at all aspects of your financing?
Yeah, well, first, I think you want to diagnose, what your relationship is with money and identify why you do the things that you do. Speak to some advisors about your wealth management plan. A lot of people don't reach out to me. I'm in all these organizations because they don't want me to know their business, right? And then sometimes people pass away, and then guess what happens? Everyone knows their business. So don't be embarrassed, because if you don't think I know DC, everyone thinks everybody has a quadrillion dollars in the bank, but speak to some professional people who can put together a plan for you and have a good process. And then for employers, make sure you have somebody coming in and talking to your employees about their plans. There's a 404C requirements that you're all familiar with, the discrimination plans. But you really want your workforce to be educated so they can maximize how much they put in the plan. That'll impact how much the higher wage earners can put into the plan. And it also mitigates the chances that they'll sue you if they somehow don't do well, if their outcomes aren't good. You want to have a professional come in and explain to them what their benefits are. It gives you some protection against liability, and also puts your workers in a better position long term.
And thank you. And just want to let you know, if you have any questions you want to ask at this time. I know people have been putting things in the chat, sending to me personally. I really appreciate that. And those of you that had to drop off, we usually try to end a little bit earlier, but we had such a dynamic panelists, and it was just an entertaining conversation. And we're putting right here a way to contact us, contact Bill Cunningham. We have his email address. And then there were lots of items on the chat. By all means, there were references to books and policies, which is part of the call to action for everyone to really focus on that. And I think we're headed in the right direction. I hear Fiona says that. Great, we are. Things will change. They're going to get better. I've seen things get better and better. I'm optimistic.
Denise, we had a question directed just to me for the panel about the difference between Black male unemployment and Black female unemployment. And I think that was Mr. Cunningham's slide, so maybe he could talk about that and what might be the root of that.
Well, certainly, Black male unemployment is higher. Again, I think it's connected to ego. I really do. I mean, being a man, especially a Black man in this society, I think drives you to be kind of competitive in a way that has negative externalities within the community. So that's it. We're seeing some turnaround there, some recognition of that. And we're certainly seeing an effort to lower those negative impacts. But that's what I think is, I can tell you, it's being a guy, we do some weird stuff, from a cooperative or non-cooperative perspective.
But the male unemployment rate is higher than the Black female unemployment rate, correct?
That's correct. The Black male unemployment rate is higher than
Right.
the Black female unemployment rate. That's correct.
Right.
Okay, thank you. We're just trying to keep up. It's 1:58. We just want to make sure that you know how to reach us and join us next time for Women's History Month. And we usually have these EI network informative information for everyone every third Thursday of the month. And join us, and you can follow us on LinkedIn. We post and all the time, and we follow us on Twitter. And we have our YouTube channels. We will have this recording, and it'll go out to everyone that joined and participated with us. And please share. And if you do need any assessment and performance guidance for your organization, any type of training, we're able to help you craft that, put that together. So so it is embedded in your organization. It's not a one and done. And we appreciate and thank everyone for coming. And we thank the panelists, Bill and Ivory. You did a great job, and we really are. We're really grateful. Any last words? And I think this is it for us.
Thanks for having us. That
Thank you
was a
for
fun
the-
discussion.
Yep, thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it. Hope this was helpful.